apologies for the delay, but we're here now. This is the next installment of the favorite albums of the 2010s series, and we're going to change things up a little bit. This time, I am going to focus on a single year, and the next episodes will all be about individual years. So this is 2015, and then there will be a video for 2016, 17, 18, 19, and then it'll be done. Then, I don't know, I'll probably give a top 10 overall of the whole decade at the end there. Before we get started, I am streaming on Twitch now. It's a new thing I've been trying out. It seems to be going pretty well. I've been streaming some of the SSX games and sort of reliving childhood, and it's been fun. So if you want to check that out, the link will be below. So I have all my favorite albums kind of in a list here jumbled up that I'm looking at, and I'm just going to I'm off script today if you couldn't tell. So I'm just going to go off the cuff about some of these albums as they come up in my list. But first, I'm just going to throw a bunch of honorable mentions on the screen. They're there, and they're gone. First is One O Tricks Point Never's Garden of Delete. This is his 90s rock album, in a sense, I guess. It's very hard-edged and aggressive and sort of angry almost, but it also retains the kind of surreal and jarring atmosphere of his previous albums like R+7 and Replica. A lot of left hooks are thrown across this album's 12 tracks. There are 12 tracks. Yeah, it's just thoroughly enjoyable. There are a lot of Daniel Lopatin's best songs on this album. He is pretty much in his own category with regards to sound design and ingenuity, and can't say enough good things. Next is the debut album from Julian Baker, Sprained Ankle. This album kind of immediately solidified Julian Baker as one of my favorite songwriters in the past few years. I did come to it a little late. I think I listened to it about 2 years after it had originally come out, but there's just something so intimate, but also you feel like you shouldn't be hearing these things that are being discussed. There's a lot of really brutal subject matter dealt with in a very kind of blunt way, and it can be uncomfortable, but also it's very, very cathartic. It's just such an amazing statement, and it's only about half an hour long, which is really saying a lot, I think. Next, another album that I was actually even later to. I only listened to this for the first time about a year and a half ago. It's Rodeo. It's Rodeo by Travis Scott. The MBDTF of
Trap. I meant to say trap.
For as tired as that comparison is, I think it's also kind of apt. There's just something about Travis Scott's particular ear for very washed out and psychedelic take on trap that he has pioneered and not really gotten back to this same level since, unfortunately, in my opinion. Astroworld's pretty good. Birds is but I think this is really one that it surprises me, because critical opinion of this when it came out was not especially positive, but it just developed this huge cult following, and it wound up going on to basically pioneer an entire new subgenre of trap, which has by this point really taken the whole airwaves and the top 40 over by storm, really. So I think a lot of credit goes to Travis Scott and his collaborators on this album in creating something that, wasn't really appreciated in its time, I guess. I mean, it's weird to say that about an album that came out 5 years ago. Next is a jazz record that I think is kind of in a weird predicament where it's sort of overrated by general music listeners and kind of underrated within the jazz community. But that doesn't mean that it's not still an incredible musical statement. It's Kamasi Washington's The Epic, of course, a 3-disc odyssey with just an incredible amount of sonic variety and richness. It's, a jazz band with an acoustic and electric rhythm section playing at the same time, with strings, with a choir, with a horn front line. The sound of all of this going on at the same time is just, it could get really, really intense and spiritual. I think this comes directly out of the lineage of somebody like Pharoah Sanders. for sure. It is in some ways sort of a throwback to that kind of 70s spiritual jazz with a really deep swing and kind of accessible soul melodies and like a gospel thing going on. But also there's this sort of influence of the new thing with hip hop. So it really runs a whole gamut across, God, like what, 3 hours of music or something like that. There's a lot to chew on, but it really is just a remarkable way to kick off a career as a solo artist. And speaking of really long albums, how about Lil Ugly Mane's Third Side of Tape compilation thing? This one is 2 hours, not quite as long, but in many ways it's even more of an intense and difficult listening experience. I mean, if you couldn't tell by this cover, which I might have to censor this when I put it up, there really are just so many different musical ideas here, and they're sequenced in such a way that is such an incredible ride. It has this quality of just kind of coasting along, and the momentum never lets up. There's no dead spots. It's really, really remarkable, especially because it runs a whole gamut of multiple different genres of hip-hop and pop and techno and black metal, sound collage, crazy shit going on. The recording of this album took place from like 1999 to 2012, so there's just bits and pieces of so many different eras of the career of Travis Miller just put into this garish, kind of hypnotic, difficult listening experience that's ultimately really, really rewarding, even as much as his more traditional hip-hop records. Moving into the world of, I guess, kind of classical chamber music, post-minimal, Colin Stetson and Sarah Neufeld never were the way she was. It's a series of duet compositions for violin and saxophone. Obviously, with it being Colin Stetson and Sarah Neufeld, it goes a lot deeper than that. They're a big fan of extended techniques for their respective instruments. Colin Stetson also plays a bass saxophone, which I alluded to in the previous video, I believe. And on this album, he also plays some contrabass clarinet, which is an even more unusual texture, especially when he starts doing his overblowing circular breathing signature style on that. It turns into this like deep guttural thing. It's really captivating. But there are also a lot of moments on this album that are very sort of sentimental and melancholic, especially with these long drawn out double stops on the violin that just sort of drone, and they really kind of put you in a space. And I just love when an album is able to do that, just completely take me into, so like, look at this tree on the cover. It sounds like this photograph. It's just so gorgeous. Next up, this is one that I think everybody considers putting on their album of the decade list at some point, just because it's so universally beloved at this point, especially after 5 years of growth. Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell. After 2 albums just crammed full of instruments and ideas and compositional quirks, he really strips things back for this one. Although that sense of detail is still felt throughout a lot of this. The way he plays with recording fidelity on this album, I think, is really interesting. Some elements of the tracks are very crystal clear, like some of the higher finger-picked string instruments, but then the vocals sound like they were recorded like on a phone or something like that. So there's this really strange thing that happens on some of these tracks sometimes where one instrumental layer will get swapped out for another that might have been recorded on a better microphone, and the whole thing just comes into focus and expands. It's just such an incredible instrumental production effect. And of course, I mean, the songs and the lyrics and everything like that, the stuff that everybody, you know, what is there to say at this point anymore about the songwriting on this album? It's just Sufjan at his absolute best in many respects. And I'm so mad that this album is so catchy and also really, really sad. Next is one that I have actually returned to a lot more than I would have otherwise suspected. Earl Sweatshirt's I Don't Like Shit, I Don't Go Outside. I think Earl Sweatshirt has really solidified himself as one of my favorite rappers, especially in these last 5 years of the 2010s. I think he was on a really, really amazing roll. But we'll talk about that in future videos. Right now, we're talking about this album, which is really where I think he seriously nails it in terms of consistency across an entire project. Don't get me wrong, I do really like Doris also, but I think it's definitely not an album without its growing pains and without its wasted moments. I mean, you had the RZA on and you didn't even he just sings a hook. He just does a hook. You didn't have him do a verse. You failed. But here, I think he really nails it in terms of mood and atmosphere and these deep, deep confessional lyrics. They're not quite as abstract as he would become later on. He still sort of has one foot in the kind of odd future-esque mindset of edginess. I did mention that Doris has its growing pains, and I think this album does too, but I think the difference is that this one really uses those growing pains to its advantage and sort of takes it and integrates it into the thematic elements of the production, which is really gloomy and despondent and kind of dizzying. And Earl's rapping is equally despondent to match. So yeah, I think this is really Earl's first master work of an album, but I do think it gets better from here. So that's also really cool. Next is another one that I definitely missed the train on at the time, but came around to it last year when I decided to go through Björk's discography from front to back. This is Volnicura, obviously, if you know anything about the chronology of Björk. This is such a switch up for an artist who at this point had been at it for like 20 years. But of course, she's known for reinventing herself every time. And on this album, it really is kind of the sequel to Vespertine, which is my favorite Björk album, actually. I think that the fact that both albums have V titles is not coincidental because they deal with the beginning and the end of the same relationship. And yeah, this is another really fucking sad album. Jesus Christ. Hearing her vocal performances on this album, she sounds sort of deflated on a lot of this album. Her trademark kind of energy only really appears sparingly throughout it. It's a very somber texture of string ensemble with electronics provided by Arca and the Haxon Cloak, and probably Björk herself, to be honest. She does have a lot more input in her music than I think people would give her credit for. And now we get into my top 3 for the year. We're coming into the home stretch. First on the chopping block is Christian Scott Atunde Ajua's Stretch Music. This is sort of the album where Christian Scott codifies a lot of the ideas that he had been developing on previous records like Yesterday You Said Tomorrow and Christian Atunde Ajua in developing what he called stretch music and titled this album Stretch Music, because this is really the pinnacle of that quest to bring all kinds of musical elements from all over the world into the form of creative improvised music. Of course, nobody is playing trumpet like this guy. He has this really striking vocal quality to a lot of his phrasing that I think really sets him apart from most other trumpet players walking the earth right now. And the intensity of these performances, especially from Corey Fonville, who's the drummer on this album and has continued as Christian Scott's drummer up until the present day, even. And flautist Elena Pinderhughes, alto saxophonist Braxton Cook made their first pretty high-profile appearances on here, especially Elena Pinderhughes. On streaming, I think this album is subtitled Introducing Elena Pinderhughes. She is absolutely a brilliant flautist and plays some incredible solos across a lot of these tracks that are really beyond category. I think this is the album of his that I return to the most, and the one that I would probably recommend to any newcomers to Christian Scott's music to start with. And then you can either go forwards or backwards from there, depending on if you want more of a traditional quote-unquote jazz thing, or if you want to go forward and see all of the creative, interesting developments that have persisted in his music up until this point, which we will talk about in upcoming videos. I feel like I'm starting to ramble, but we're almost done. All right, next, if you know me, you know I gotta talk about Death Grips and the powers that be. I don't really discriminate between Disc 1 and Disc 2. I feel like a lot of people treat them as their own things, but really I think they pair unbelievably well together. They just have such opposite moods and such opposite sound palettes that the juxtaposition of them is really what creates a lot of the interest for me. Disc 1 features a lot of samples from Björk played on an electronic drum kit by Zach Hill and lots of other electronic, distorted, very, very discordant sounds. Probably some of the most out there stuff that the band had made up until this point and still has, honestly. Whereas the next album really feels like a punk rock concert in a stadium, and you're just getting whooped in the ass by these guitars played by Nick Reinhardt from Terra Melos. There's just so many moments of highly, highly distorted, huge sounding riffs and big ass yelling from MC Ride. Big ass yelling. In talking about MC Ride's contributions to this album, you have to mention the very, very, very depressive state that he portrays himself as being in across both of these discs. Disc 1 sort of deals with his internal conflicts, ideation of suicide, his disregard for his own mortality. The very first line of this album is, "I'll take my life like I kept it," which I think really, really, really sets the tone for a lot more of this album. It deals with a lot of hedonistic subject matter. There's a lot of sexual song titles on this disc, which sort of indicates a kind of pathology, I suppose. And then when you get to disc 2, it's very much about the external response to that internal strife, the violence that he inflicts on other people. But then also, by the end of the album, it turns around and we get the greatest Death Grip song of all time, On GP, which is just a whole look in the mirror. He addresses himself by his given name, Stefan, which, oh, that hurts. That hurts so much. Yeah, I mean, holy shit. Holy shit. What a brilliant album. And finally, I mean, there's no point in even, I've saved it for last, but you already fucking know I'm going to talk about To Pimp a Butterfly. You already know I'm going to talk about To Pimp a Butterfly. I think nobody really knew in 2015 at the time what this album would come to represent. It really was this unbelievable moment right before the beginning of the Trump presidency, right at this moment where things felt really fucking weird. And Kendrick Lamar drops this album and he says, "You know what? We're gonna be alright." And you almost believe him. This is another one of those cases where what can I even really say that hasn't been said already? I mean, the laundry list of amazing producers and artistic collaborators, musicians. One guest rapper, Rhapsody, who absolutely destroys it. But also Thundercat, Robert Glasper, Terrace Martin, George Clinton, and it just draws from an unbelievable gamut of Black American music and just, again, really integrates all of this stuff together with all different kinds of hip-hop and all different flavors of soul, R&B, funk, gospel, blues. They're all rolled into here at some point or another. It's a really brilliant mosaic, over the top of which Kendrick Lamar just is absolutely destroying it in terms of storytelling. This is one of the all-time great concept albums, and it's 5 years old now. I think we can start speaking in these kind of hyperbolic terms, but I really do think that by this point, if you don't consider this album classic, like, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? I mean, even if you're not necessarily into the music, I know a lot of people are a little apprehensive about this album compared to, say, Good Kid, Mad City, because that one, admittedly, it's much hookier. The beats are a little more approachable, but I think if you're a fan of just music in general, there's just so much to pick out in this album. There's just so many details. And this story about fame and celebrity and influence and your relationship with your audience as an artist, it really is the album that Kendrick should have won the fucking Pulitzer Prize for, I swear to God. So, yeah, those are all the albums from 2015 that I have things to say about. I'm going to try and edit this down now into something that's comprehensible. And I will see you for more of these unscripted videos just to try and get myself back on my feet after being away from the channel for a while. I'm just trying to do it, you know? Not trying to think about it too much, just trying to do it. So, as long as you're watching, I'll keep doing it. So, yeah, bye.